So picture this. It is 3 o'clock in the morning. You are in that perfect deep stage of sleep.
Oh, yeah. The best kind.
Right. The kind where the world just entirely ceases to exist. Your breathing is slow, the room is pitch black, and you are just completely at peace. And then right by your ear, you hear it.
Oh, no.
Yeah, that high-pitched, unmistakable, erratic whine of a single mosquito.
It might actually be the most psychologically destructive sound in the natural world.
It really is.
It completely overrides every rational circuit in your brain, like instantly.
Instantly. So what do? Because you are wired, biologically and evolutionarily, to react to a parasite. So you slap your own ear.
And you miss, obviously.
You miss, obviously. The whining stops for a second, then it comes back, maybe a little closer this time. Now you are awake.
Heart rate is climbing.
Oh, your heart rate is climbing. You turn on the bedside lamp, which instantly blinds you. You're standing on the mattress. You're rolling up a magazine, aggressively scanning the ceiling, just swatting at shadow.
Total panic mode.
Exactly. You end up knocking over a glass of water, soaking your phone. You wake up your partner, an argument ensues. Your adrenaline is spiking, and you have entirely ruined your night.
And the mosquito.
The mosquito. It's probably just resting quietly behind the curtain, completely unharmed, digesting a microscopic drop of your blood.
Yeah, I mean, it is the absolute perfect illustration of a profound strategic failure.
How so?
Well, you look at the mechanics of what just happened. You took a minor annoyance,
Right.
a tiny biological irritant that barely registers on the scale of actual threats.
Barely registers.
And through your own aggressive reaction, you elevated it into an event that destroyed your peace, your environment, and your primary objective, which was simply to sleep.
Right.
The mosquito didn't ruin your night. Your reaction to the mosquito ruined your night.
That is so true. And that extremely frustrating scenario is exactly the trap we're decoding today. Welcome to the deep dive, by the way.
Glad to be here for this one.
Yeah, so today we are taking a singular, highly concentrated concept from the historical study of power dynamics. Specifically, the law that dictates you must disdain the things you cannot have.
And that ignoring a problem is often the most devastating revenge you can enact.
Right. So the overarching mission for you, the listener, today is to completely rewire how you view confrontation. Because from the time we are children, we are taught to address problems head on.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
We are conditioned to stand up for ourselves.
Yeah.
To set the record straight, to aggressively fix a mistake, to, swat the mosquito.
But the historical record suggests something wildly counterintuitive. By acknowledging a petty problem or an irritating rival, you actually breathe life into it.
You give it mass.
Yes, you grant it credibility. So today we are looking at how weaponizing disdain and practicing tactical, cold-blooded indifference can give you the absolute upper hand in virtually any dynamic.
And conversely, we're going to look at some of the most massive historical blunders where incredibly powerful people, presidents, kings, global titans, were completely destroyed.
Just because they couldn't stop themselves from overreacting.
Exactly. They could be helped themselves.
So let's start with the foundational premise here.
The premise is that attention is a currency. In fact, it is your most highly valued, finite currency.
Right.
When you pay attention to an enemy, or even, say, a troll on the internet, you are funding their operation. You become partners in a dance.
You match their steps.
You match their steps.
Yeah.
And in doing so, you surrender your own initiative because your actions are no longer self-directed. They're entirely dictated by their provocations.
I want to look at exactly how that dance plays out when the stakes are infinitely higher than a mosquito in a bedroom.
No.
Let's travel back to 1916.
Okay, setting the scene.
The border of Mexico and the United States. We have the bandit, Pancho Villa, and the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson. This is perhaps the greatest case study in the catastrophic trap of engagement.
It is a phenomenal disaster. I mean, to understand the exact nature of the mistake Woodrow Wilson made, we really have to deeply analyze Pancho Villa's character arc.
Okay, let's get into it.
Because his psychological state in 1916 is the catalyst for everything.
Right, because Villa wasn't always just a desperate nuisance to the United States. He had a massive cultural footprint.
A colossal footprint.
Yeah.
I mean, Villa started as the chief of a gang of bandits in the northern state of Chihuahua. But when the Mexican Revolution broke out in 1910, his status completely metamorphosed.
He leveled up.
He really did. He wasn't just a criminal anymore. He became a revolutionary general, a larger-than-life folk hero. He was robbing trains, supposedly funneling wealth to the poor, and leading these incredibly daring, swashbuckling cavalry charges.
And people loved it.
Oh, his exploits actually fascinated the American public at the time. Hollywood even sent film crews down to Mexico to embed with his army.
Wait, really? Film crews?
Yeah, literal film crews. He was perceived as this romantic figure, part Robin Hood, part Don Juan.
People are absolutely intoxicated by a rogue who bucks the system.
Right up until the system crushes him and he loses his luster.
Which is exactly what happened.
Exactly. The revolution was a brutal, multi-factional conflict. And after years of bitter fighting, another general, Venustiano Carranza, emerged as the victor and the recognized leader of Mexico.
Leaving Villa out in the cold?
Comprehensively defeated. His massive army of the north was shattered. He and his remaining loyalists had to retreat into the rugged mountains of Chihuahua. And this is where the psychology of relevance, or the terror of irrelevance, takes over.
Because his power base is gone.
Completely gone. His army has dwindled from tens of thousands to a few hundred tired men. He has zero political leverage. So to survive, he reverts to mere banditry.
But it's different this time.
It's very different. He's no longer robbing the rich to feed the poor. He's just robbing the local Mexican people to feed his desperate gang.
Which obviously tanks his popularity.
Completely tanks it. The locals are exhausted by a decade of war. They want peace. They want to rebuild their farms. Villa is no longer a hero to them.
He's just a pest.
He is an irritating ghost of a bygone era. He is becoming irrelevant.
And if there is one thing history teaches us, it's that an ego accustomed to global adoration will do incredibly dangerous things when it feels itself slipping into obscurity.
Precisely. Villa is desperate for a mechanism to regain his status. He needs a new villain, a new scapegoat that can unite the Mexican people behind him again.
So he looks north.
He begins to rail violently against the United States, blaming the gringos for all of Mexico's troubles and for Carranza's success. And in March of 1916, he crosses the Rubicon from fiery rhetoric to catastrophic action.
The Columbus raid.
Yes. He leads his men across the border and raids the sleepy town of Columbus, New Mexico. They burn buildings, loot stores, and when the dust settles, 17 American soldiers and civilians are dead.
It is a horrific event, a genuine tragedy, and it forces an immense, suffocating dilemma onto the desk of President Woodrow Wilson.
An impossible situation, really.
You have to look at the political climate of 1916. World War I is raging in Europe, though the U.S. hasn't entered it yet. Wilson has built a brand as a somewhat high-minded, pacifist academic.
He kept America out of the European meat grinder.
Exactly. But now, foreign bandits have crossed the border and spilled American blood on American soil. The pressure in the Oval Office must have been absolute bedlam.
Oh, the psychological pressure on a leader in that exact scenario is almost mathematically predictable. The global stage is watching. His political rivals are smelling blood in the water.
And his advisors are probably screaming at him to do something.
The advisors surrounding Wilson hammer home one single narrative. They tell him that for a global industrial power like the United States, failing to strike back with overwhelming, crushing force would send a disastrous signal of weakness to the world.
And there's the domestic pressure, too.
Furthermore, yes, the domestic angle.
Mm.
The Republican opposition was painting Wilson as timid, as a coward. His advisors effectively told him that his very masculinity, his manliness as a leader, was on trial.
He had to act aggressively.
He had to.
So Wilson takes the bait. He feels the sting of the mosquito. He panics about how he looks to the people in the room, and he decides to swat it with a sledgehammer.
A massive sledgehammer.
Before the month is out, he organizes the punitive expedition. He secures a very reluctant, highly conditional approval from the Carranza government in Mexico, and he sends an army of 10,000 highly trained soldiers across the border.
And he puts General John J. Pershing in charge.
Blackjack Pershing.
Right. And he wasn't just any officer. He was a highly decorated, dashing, rigorously disciplined military leader. He had successfully fought counterinsurgencies in the Philippines and had extensive experience in the American Southwest.
On paper, this is an entirely lopsided, almost comical mismatch. You have the vanguard of the modern U.S. Army deploying against a ragtag, starving gang of maybe 400 bandits riding tired horses.
It's billed as the ultimate showcase of American supremacy.
You have carloads of reporters from New York and Chicago following Pershing's columns into the desert. The troops are equipped with the absolute bleeding edge of military technology.
Motorized supply trucks, field radios.
They even deployed the first Aero Squadron, actual biplanes, to conduct aerial reconnaissance over the mountains. It was supposed to be a surgical, high-tech eradication of a nuisance.
But here's where the dynamic of interaction violently flips.
Okay, let's talk about the flip.
Remember the psychological state of the local Mexican population in Chihuahua just a month prior. They were disillusioned with Villa. They viewed him as a washed-up thug stealing their cattle.
Right, they are over him.
But suddenly there is a massive, heavily armed, highly aggressive foreign army marching through their sovereign territory. They're kicking up dust, demanding supplies, treating the locals with suspicion.
So what happens to the psychological landscape?
Villa is instantly resurrected. He goes from being a localized pest to the sole Mexican patriot willing to stand up to the invading American empire. He becomes an underdog legend overnight.
It's an overnight PR miracle for Pancho Villa, entirely manufactured and funded by Woodrow Wilson.
Yes, and this shift in local sentiment completely unravels Pershing's high-tech expedition.
Because they need the locals.
The Americans desperately need intelligence to navigate this incredibly hostile, unmapped terrain. But the locals, who would have gladly sold Villa out a month ago, are now actively protecting him.
Oh, wow.
They start feeding Pershing scouts deliberate, highly coordinated false leads. A farmer will swear he saw Villa riding north. The Americans dispatch their planes, mobilize their cavalry, exhaust their men pushing north through the brutal heat, only to find empty rocks.
Meanwhile, Villa is slipping south.
Exactly. It becomes a theater of the absurd. The logistics of the expedition start eating themselves.
You have these canvas and wood biplanes crashing in the desert winds. The motorized trucks are breaking down, sinking up to their axles in mud and sand, forcing the army to rely on mules again.
And the scale of the error compounds itself. Because Pershing can't catch him, Wilson feels embarrassed.
So he doubles down.
He doubles down. He pours more troops in. By the summer of 1916, that initial force of 10,000 men had ballooned into an occupying army of 123,000 National Guardsmen.
That is insane.
123,000 men stationed along the border and deep into Mexico. Imagine the logistical nightmare of supplying that many men in a foreign desert. They are suffering through stultifying heat, dysentery, massive swarms of mosquitoes, and incredibly harsh, wild terrain.
And they are trudging through a country where the local population and soon the official Mexican government itself grew absolutely infuriated and openly hostile to their presence.
And the climax of this entire debacle is almost too cinematic to be real.
Tell me about the cave.
Right. So there's a documented moment where Pancho Villa actually sustains a gunshot wound. Not from the Americans, mind you, but in a random skirmish with Carranza's Mexican forces.
He's severely wounded.
Severely wounded. His men hide him in a deep mountain cave so he can recover. And from the high vantage point of this cave, Villa literally just sits there, nursing his leg, looking down into the valley.
And what does he see?
He watches General Pershing lead these exhausted, miserable, dust-covered American columns back and forth across the mountains, endlessly chasing ghosts.
It perfectly embodies the physics of the chase.
It really does. The harder Pershing pushed, the more elusive Villa became. The affair dragged on through the blistering summer into the fall and straight into the freezing winter.
And the American public back home.
The public, who had initially demanded blood and vengeance, started reading the newspaper reports and began viewing the whole enterprise as a slapstick farce.
The narrative flipped completely.
They actually started admiring Villa again for his sheer resourcefulness and audacity in eluding this lumbering, high-tech military behemoth.
So, by January of 1917, nearly a year later, Wilson has to swallow his pride and throw in the towel. He orders Pershing to withdraw.
And it is not a quiet, dignified, mission-accomplished withdrawal.
Not at all. As the U.S. troops are marching back toward Texas, Mexican rebel forces are actively pursuing them. They are taking pot shots at the American columns, harassing their rear guard, forcing the mighty U.S. Army to literally deploy its biplanes just to cover its retreat.
It was a withdrawal of the most humiliating tail-between-the-legs variety.
And Pancho Villa. He understood exactly what had happened. He summed up the dynamic perfectly later on. He pointed out the sheer absurdity of the numbers.
Right. He essentially noted that it cost the American government $130 million, an astronomical sum at the time.
To hunt him through rough, hilly country.
He led them on a wild goose chase where they found nothing but the sun and the mosquitoes. And at the end of it all, absolutely nothing was gained.
You know, I have to step in here and challenge this because you're listening to this story right now and you're probably thinking the exact same thing I am.
Let's hear it.
17 American citizens were murdered in their beds in New Mexico. How could President Wilson possibly, practically, just ignore that?
It's a fair question.
If he does absolutely nothing, doesn't he validate the criticisms? Doesn't he look incredibly weak to the German Empire, to the British, to everyone watching? Doesn't inaction invite more border raids?
That is the crucial million-dollar question. And it is exactly the trap of binary thinking that Wilson's advisors fell into.
Binary thinking.
They believed the only two options were passive weakness or massive public retaliation.
Yeah.
But the law of disdain is not about rolling over and playing dead. It is not about passive weakness.
What is it about then?
It is about the meticulous, strategic management of your energy and your attention. If an irritant is impossible to ignore, and you are entirely correct, a lethal cross-border raid cannot be ignored. You must handle it without drawing public attention to it.
So keep it quiet?
You must neutralize the threat without giving the mosquito the dignity of a press conference.
So what were the actual practical alternatives available to the President of the United States in 1916?
Well, if we look at the geopolitical board at the time, Wilson had several highly effective low-profile options.
Which is?
First, he could have applied intense, quiet, crippling, diplomatic and economic pressure on the Carranza government.
Leverage Mexico itself.
Exactly. Carranza had just won the revolution. His government was fragile, bankrupt, and desperately needed American recognition and trade.
So Wilson could have just privately told Carranza, you eliminate Villa, or we embargo your entire economy.
Precisely. Carranza had the local knowledge, the spies, and the terrain advantage to hunt Villa quietly.
Outsource the extermination to the local authority.
Exactly. Second, since the Mexican people in Chihuahua were already exhausted by Villa before the American invasion, Wilson could have worked secretly with local Mexican factions.
Covert ops.
He could have funded a small, targeted, covert bounty operation. A massive bag of gold quietly offered to Villa's starving lieutenants would have likely solved the problem from the inside within a month.
Money talks. What was the third option?
Third, he could have heavily fortified the American side of the border with those 100,000 National Guardsmen, organized a quiet, lethal trap, and simply waited for Villa to get desperate and try to raid again.
But instead of a quiet surgical strike, he brought a marching band, 123,000 troops, and the entire New York press corps.
He made it a public spectacle because he was fighting for his own ego, not for strategic efficacy. He tried to teach Villa a lesson and put on a theatrical display of America's might.
And it backfired spectacularly.
The longer the expedition floundered in the desert, the more it focused global attention on American logistical incompetence and Villa's cunning. The global audience completely forgot about the tragic, inciting incident in Columbus.
The narrative completely shifted.
The grotesque imbalance between the giant pursuer and the tiny pursued made the whole affair a joke.
He inadvertently built a $100 million monument to Pancho Villa's legend, all while humiliating himself.
Which is exactly why this law of power is so critical to understand.
Which leads us to a fascinating psychological intersection. If reacting with force so often backfires and makes the problem worse, we need to rigorously examine the underlying mechanics of human psychology.
We have to ask why.
Why does ignoring someone work so well? Why does silence hurt a provocateur more than a bullet?
To understand the sheer devastating power of tactical disdain, we have to look at the core neurochemistry and social dynamics of human interaction.
Okay, let's break that down.
When you pay attention to a person, even negatively, you are validating their existence and their impact on reality.
By acknowledging them.
By acknowledging someone, you are inherently communicating that they have the power to alter your emotional state. You open yourself to their influence.
It is the exact same dynamic as getting into an argument with an internet troll.
Oh, perfect analogy.
We have all experienced this trap. You are scrolling through a feed, you see a comment that is just so aggressively wrong, so deliberately insulting, and you feel that hot flash of righteous indignation.
Okay, debate.
You think, I am going to dismantle this person's argument, I am going to educate them. But the millisecond you hit reply, you have already lost the war.
Because you have given them exactly what they were mining for.
Precisely. You have handed over your time, your intellectual focus, and your emotional real estate. Trolls don't care if you agree with them or if you write a 10-page essay destroying their logic.
They just want the engagement.
They only care that they forced you to stop your life and engage with them. By reacting, you validated their existence. You proved that their words have the power to command your behavior.
That is a phenomenal modern parallel. Contempt, on the other hand, is a psychological severing. It is the absolute denial of that validation.
The ultimate block button.
Exactly. If we look deeply at the human psyche, we see the paradox of desire. The more intensely you want something, the more frantically you chase after it, the more it seems to elude you.
Like trying to catch water in your hand.
Yes. And conversely, displaying uncontrollable desire or uncontrollable anger immediately signals a lack of self-regulation. It makes you appear reactive, weak, and pathetic.
There is a brilliant fable from the 19th century Russian writer Ivan Krylov that perfectly captures this maddening physics of desire.
Oh, the shadow fable.
Yes, the shadow fable. It's about a man walking in the late afternoon sun, and he suddenly decides he wants to catch his own shadow.
Good luck with that.
Right. He takes a deliberate step toward it, and the shadow moves exactly one step away. He quickens his pace to a brisk walk. The shadow matches his speed flawlessly.
So he gets frustrated.
Frustration sets in, so he starts jogging. The shadow jogs. Finally, he is sprinting across a field, lunging desperately, trying to physically grab this dark shape on the grass. But the faster and harder he runs, the faster the shadow flees.
Naturally.
Exhausted, panting, and defeated, he finally gives up. He turns his back on the shadow and starts walking toward home. And what happens?
The shadow immediately starts following him.
Attached to his heels.
It is a profoundly elegant observation of human social dynamics. When you aggressively withhold your attention, you create a psychological vacuum.
And human beings hate a vacuum.
Human beings, especially narcissistic or provocative human beings, absolutely abhor a psychological vacuum. When someone hurls an insult at you or tries to provoke a reaction, they are leaning into you.
Expecting you to push back.
They brace themselves for your pushback. When you don't push back, when you simply sidestep and offer nothing but empty space, they lose their balance. They fall forward flat on their face.
We also have to look at La Fontaine's famous fable of the fox and the grapes because it completely flips how we understand modern psychology.
The classic sour grape story.
We all know the basic story. A starving fox sees these luscious purple grapes dangling high up on a trellis. He jumps, he snaps his jaws, he scrambles up the wood, but he just can't quite reach them.
He's trying everything.
Finally, exhausted, he walks away muttering, "Ah, well, they're probably sour anyway, only good for green fools to eat." Now, in modern vernacular, we use the term sour grapes as a derogatory insult.
Right, we use it to mock someone who is transparently coping with failure.
Exactly. Our modern interpretation frames it as a pathetic defense mechanism, a clear sign of a bruised ego and weakness. But what is truly fascinating is the psychological reframing of this concept. From the perspective of power dynamics, wasn't the fox actually exhibiting supreme tactical wisdom?
When you think about the alternative, yes. Think about what the alternative is. The alternative is the fox sitting beneath the trellis, weeping, complaining to the other animals about the unfairness of the height of the vine,
Throwing a tantrum.
obsessing over the grapes, and visibly demonstrating his starvation and impotence. Crying sour grapes, when executed correctly and with conviction, is actually a genuine power move.
A power move.
If there is something you deeply desire but absolutely cannot attain, the most destructive thing you can do to your own status is to draw public attention to your disappointment.
Never let them see you sweat.
By acting as if the object never truly interested you in the first place, you dictate the narrative. You maintain an aura of superiority and unbothered detachment.
It's the weaponization of absolute silence. And there's this incredibly sharp anecdote involving the early 20th century English writer G.K. Chesterton that illustrates this perfectly.
Oh, the feud with George Bernard Shaw.
Yes. Chesterton held some very specific economic and social views, and he was being absolutely dragged in the press by the legendary playwright George Bernard Shaw.
And Shaw was no lightweight.
Shaw was a titan of wit, a Nobel laureate, and he was dedicating columns of newspaper space to publicly, eloquently abusing Chesterton's ideas and intellect. The literary world is watching with bated breath.
They want to fight.
Chesterton's friends are waiting for the brilliant rebuttal. They know Chesterton is a genius, and they are ready for an epic war of words. Days pass, weeks pass, Chesterton writes nothing.
Total radio silence.
Finally, a close friend of his, the historian Hilaire Belloc, loses his patience. He goes to Chesterton and reproaches him, basically demanding to know, why aren't you fighting back? Why are you letting him humiliate you?
And Chesterton's reply is a masterclass in psychological warfare.
What does he say?
He looks at Belloc and says, "My dear Belloc, I have answered him. To a man of Shaw's wit, silence is the one unbearable repartee."
The one unbearable repartee. That is so cold and yet so deeply insightful into Shaw's psychology.
Because it hits the precise vulnerability of the provocateur. For a man like Shaw, who prides himself entirely on his intellect, his rhetorical brilliance, and his ability to elicit a reaction from society, being met with a void is a fate exponentially worse than being insulted.
If Chesterton had insulted him, it would have proven that Shaw's words had landed a blow.
It would have validated Shaw's power. Silence, however, heavily implies that Shaw's brilliant, painstakingly crafted insults didn't even leave a scratch. It suggests Shaw is entirely beneath notice.
Completely irrelevant.
The philosopher Idries Shah summed up this human algorithm perfectly. He said, kick him, he'll forgive you. Flatter him, he may or may not see through you. But ignore him, and he'll hate you.
Okay, so this philosophy sounds incredibly profound in the abstract. It makes total, flawless psychological sense when we are talking about foxes, shatters, and literary feuds.
But how does it look on a grand scale?
Right. How does this actually manifest when executed perfectly by a master on a massive historical scale? We saw Woodrow Wilson fail miserably by overreacting. Let's look at someone who used tactical disdain to completely conquer the insurmountable.
Okay, where are we going?
We are going back to the year 1527 to the English court to examine the ultimate power pose, a king's contempt.
Oh, this is a breathtaking observance of strategic indifference. We are talking about King Henry VIII of England, his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and the Pope in Rome, Clement VII.
Let's clearly define the stakes here because they literally could not be higher. This is not a petty squabble. This is about the survival of an entire royal dynasty.
A dynasty on the brink.
King Henry VIII desperately needs a legitimate male heir to ensure the Tudor line continues and to prevent England from plunging back into civil war.
But his wife, Catherine of Aragon, despite numerous pregnancies, has failed to produce a surviving son.
They have one daughter, Mary. But in the 16th century, a female heir is considered a recipe for political instability. And by the late 1520s, Catherine has entered menopause. The biological clock hasn't just run out, it's shattered.
For Henry, this is a crisis of apocalyptic proportions. And because he is a deeply religious, highly paranoid man, he convinces himself he knows exactly why God is actively punishing him.
Right. The historical context of their marriage is the key. Before marrying Henry, Catherine had actually been married to Henry's older brother, Arthur, the original heir to the throne.
But Arthur died of sweating sickness just 5 months into the marriage.
To maintain a crucial political and financial alliance with the rising superpower of Spain, the English crown arranged for young Henry to marry his brother's widow. At the time, they had to get a special papal dispensation to allow it.
But now, decades later, desperate for a way out of the marriage, Henry starts aggressively reading his Bible.
Convenient timing.
Very convenient. He points to a very specific passage in the book of Leviticus, which states that if a man takes his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing and they shall remain childless.
So he decides that the original papal dispensation was a mistake. He concludes that his marriage is inherently incestuous, cursed by God, and therefore legally null and void.
And of course, there's another significantly more pressing biological reason driving his urgency.
Anne Boleyn.
He has fallen completely, madly in love with a younger, deeply ambitious woman in his court, Anne Boleyn. Anne is refusing to be just his mistress. She demands to be queen.
Henry firmly believes that if he can marry Anne, he can finally sire a legitimate son. So he needs an annulment from Catherine. But there is a massive, seemingly immovable obstacle standing directly in his path.
The ultimate geopolitical obstacle of the European Renaissance, Pope Clement VII and the Vatican.
Henry is a Catholic king. He must apply to the Pope for the annulment. Under normal circumstances, popes granted annulments to monarchs fairly regularly to keep the peace.
But Clement is trapped in a completely paralyzing political vice. Catherine of Aragon was not just some random noblewoman. She was the aunt of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V.
And Charles is the most powerful monarch in Europe.
In fact, in 1527, Charles's mutinous troops had literally sacked the city of Rome, and Pope Clement was essentially living as a prisoner in the Castel San Angelo, entirely at Charles's mercy.
Wow, talk about a rock in a hard place.
Clement could not possibly afford to infuriate the emperor by publicly disgracing his beloved aunt.
So the Pope is terrified of the emperor, but he also doesn't want to lose the allegiance of England. If I'm Clement, my absolute only play here is to stall. I need to kick the can down the road and pray the situation resolves itself. Is that what he did?
That is exactly what he did. Clement relies on the classic bureaucratic power tactic of the weak. He doesn't give Henry a flat no, because a no forces a definitive reaction.
So he strings him along.
Instead, he plays for time. He promises flexibility. He establishes slow-moving theological commissions. He dispatches envoys on long journeys to London who have secret orders to delay proceedings.
Bureaucratic quicksand.
He demands to see original documents from Spain. He wants to bog Henry down in endless, labyrinthine legal negotiations, quietly hoping that either Henry's infatuation with Anne Boleyn will naturally fade over a few years, or that Catherine of Aragon, who is frequently ill, will simply die.
He wants to engage Henry in the dance. He wants Henry swatting at the mosquito, exhausting his energy in the papal courts.
Precisely. And if we look at the other side of the equation, Catherine of Aragon is an incredibly strong-willed, fiercely devout, immensely popular woman in England.
She is not backing down.
She absolutely refuses to go quietly. She refuses to abdicate her title. Henry repeatedly urges her to voluntarily enter a nunnery, which would elegantly solve the problem, and she flatly refuses, stating she is the true and rightful Queen of England.
Had Henry locked horns with Catherine directly, trying to bully or argue her into submission, he would have found himself mired in endless, agonizing domestic warfare.
It would have alienated his subjects and worn him down psychologically. And had he played the Pope's game, he would have been trapped in the Vatican's bureaucratic quicksand until he died without an heir.
But Henry, despite his flaws, possesses a brilliant, almost feral political instinct. He recognizes the trap.
He realizes that arguing with Catherine validates her position as a combatant.
Right. And he realizes that pleading with the Pope as a form of submission is explicitly asking for permission from an authority who refuses to grant it. So he decides to flip the board over. He stops playing the game entirely.
He unleashes a masterstroke of total, devastating institutional disdain.
He weaponizes his indifference on a scale Europe had never seen. First, he targets Catherine.
He doesn't debate her theology. He simply erases her status. He stops sleeping in the same bed with her. He publicly declares that his conscience will no longer allow him to live in sin, and that he now considers her purely his sister-in-law, not his lawful wife.
So brutal.
He strips her of her title as queen and insists she be addressed only as the Princess Dowager of Wales, her title from her brief marriage to his brother. Finally, in 1531, he banishes her from the court entirely, shipping her off to a series of distant, damp, isolated castles in the countryside.
Out of sight, out of mind. And the Pope. What happens when you ignore the most powerful religious figure in the known world?
The Pope finally realizes the stalling tactics have failed, so he resorts to his ultimate weapon. He orders Henry to return Catherine to the court and abandon Anne Boleyn on pain of excommunication.
Which was a massive deal back then.
We have to understand the gravity of this. In the 16th century, excommunication was the nuclear option. It meant your soul was condemned to eternal damnation. It meant you were cut off from the sacrament.
And politically.
Crucially, it meant your subjects were theoretically freed from their oath of allegiance to you, and any foreign Catholic monarch was morally justified in invading your country and deposing you. It was designed to bring kings to their knees in terror.
And what does Henry do? Does he write a frantic, groveling letter? Does he send an army to march on Rome?
He literally just ignores it.
Unbelievable.
He acts as if the Pope's words are meaningless vibrations in the air. He refuses to acknowledge that the Pope has any jurisdiction over his soul or his kingdom.
He insists his marriage to Catherine is dissolved by his own authority, and in early 1533, he marries Anne Boleyn in a secret ceremony.
It's the ultimate scene and left on red.
Yes. When Clement refuses to recognize the marriage, Henry no longer cares. He completely bypasses the authority he cannot control.
He uses his parliament to pass a series of acts breaking England's ties with the Roman Catholic Church entirely. He establishes the Church of England, legally installs himself as the supreme earthly head of this new church, and has his newly formed, compliant religious apparatus proclaim Anne Boleyn as the rightful queen.
The Pope tries every spiritual and political threat in the medieval arsenal, but because Henry simply refuses to engage with the premise of the threats, none of them work.
Clement was reportedly left fuming in Rome. No monarch had ever treated the papacy so contemptuously. Henry utterly humiliated the institution, and the Pope had absolutely no recourse.
Even the threat of excommunication completely lost its power, because its power relied entirely on the victim believing in it.
It is the offensive aspect of disdain in its purest, most distilled form. Playing the card of contempt allows you to determine the geography of the conflict. The war is waged strictly on your terms, within your own defined reality.
It is the ultimate power pose. You are the sovereign, and you possess the absolute right to ignore that which offends you.
The contrast here is mind-blowing. Think about the dichotomy between Woodrow Wilson and Henry VIII.
Oh, it's night and day.
Wilson had massive military superiority, a booming industrial economy, and all the tangible power in the world. He tried to crush a minor, localized problem with overwhelming force, engaged in the dance, and was utterly humiliated by a bandit in a cave.
While Henry VIII faced the greatest spiritual and political authority in the Western Hemisphere, an institution backed by empires, and he wielded nothing but pure, unadulterated bureaucratic disdain. and he completely conquered it.
But we cannot analyze this without deeply examining the human cost,
Got it.
because disdain is not a clean weapon. It is a brutal, psychological meat grinder.
Catherine of Aragon felt the devastating, agonizing sting of this contempt.
She was a woman who had been queen for over 2 decades. She tried desperately to fight back. She wrote passionate letters to Henry. She smuggled appeals to the Pope. She begged for an audience.
But her words fell into an absolute void.
She was met with a wall of silence. She was isolated from her friends, separated from her daughter Mary, and completely ignored by the man she still considered her husband.
The historical accounts of her final years are deeply tragic.
Driven mad with frustration, stripped of her identity, and confined to drafty, moldering estates, her health plummeted. She slowly deteriorated in isolation and died in early 1536.
And the autopsy was shocking, right?
The autopsy reported a blackened, cancerous growth on her heart. In a very real sense, the sheer weight of being systematically ignored literally broke her heart.
It is a chilling reminder that this isn't just theory. It is a profound weaponization of human neurobiology. Withholding attention can destroy a person from the inside out.
But this concept doesn't just apply to how we neutralize our enemies, our exes, or our obstacles.
There is a completely different, equally vital application of this philosophy. What happens when the threat isn't coming from the outside? What happens when we are the ones who drop the ball?
When we make the mistake.
Exactly. What happens when we try too aggressively to fix our own mistakes?
This is a critical psychological pivot. It is the inherent danger of the fix. We all possess this deeply ingrained instinct.
Oh, the panic response.
You make an error at work, you send an email to the wrong person, you drop a glass at a party, and your immediate panicked reaction is to scramble. You try to cover it up, you over-explain it, you launch an aggressive initiative to repair it.
But history demonstrates that the harder and more frantically we try to fix certain types of mistakes, the more radioactive we make them.
Let's look at a fascinating modern historical example of this. And just to clarify, we are looking at this purely through the lens of strategic action and reaction, focusing entirely on the mechanics of power and paranoia.
We need to talk about Henry Kissinger, the Nixon administration, and the utter meltdown surrounding the Pentagon Papers.
The year's 1971. The New York Times begins publishing excerpts from the Pentagon Papers.
For context, this was a massive, highly classified study commissioned by the Department of Defense detailing the real, often deeply cynical history of U.S. political and military involvement in Vietnam from 1945 to 1967.
It was leaked to the press by a military analyst named Daniel Ellsberg.
Now, from a strictly objective, strategic standpoint, the publication of these papers was highly embarrassing to the U.S. government, yes. But it was not actually a fatal existential threat to the Nixon administration itself. Why?
Because the vast majority of the damning information, the lies and the miscalculations, pertain to the previous administrations, specifically Lyndon B. Johnson and John F. Kennedy.
So Nixon could have, theoretically, just sat back and watched the Democrats take the heat. But Henry Kissinger, who was Nixon's national security advisor and wielded immense influence, did not see it that way at all. Why was his reaction so visceral?
It comes down to the psychology of control. Kissinger was a man who operated entirely on secrecy, back-channel negotiations, and absolute control of information.
He liked being the man behind the curtain.
Exactly. The very fact that a leak of this magnitude could occur within the government apparatus shattered his sense of security. He erupted into what witnesses described as a volcanic rage.
He wasn't necessarily furious about the content of the papers. He was terrified by the administration's vulnerability. He felt a profound loss of control.
He convinced Nixon that if they didn't crush this leak, they would look weak to the Soviets, and they would never be able to conduct secret diplomacy again.
So he decides he has to fix it. He has to violently plug the holes in the ship.
And this is where the butterfly effect of overreacting takes flight and alters the course of the 20th century. Kissinger's aggressive, paranoid recommendations eventually lead the administration to form a clandestine, highly illegal, covert operations group within the White House.
And in a moment of sheer irony, they literally call themselves the plumbers because their explicit job was to plug the leaks and destroy Ellsberg's credibility.
They burglarized the office of Ellsberg's psychiatrist, trying to find dirt to smear him. They embraced a culture of total lawless paranoia in the name of security.
Which sounds like a dark comedy, but the consequences were historic because who were the plumbers?
Right. This exact same unit, operating under the same paranoid mandate to protect the president's secrets, is the group that, a short time later, broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex.
That botched break-in and the subsequent desperate cover-up orchestrated by the White House set off the catastrophic chain of events that ultimately led to Richard Nixon becoming the first and only U.S. president to resign from office in absolute disgrace.
There is a wonderful, highly illustrative little fable from Leo Tolstoy that perfectly encapsulates the exact psychological error Kissinger made.
Oh, the monkey and the peas.
Yes, a monkey is walking through the forest carrying two massive handfuls of peas. As he's walking, one single tiny pea slips from his fingers and drops into the dirt.
Just one pea.
He stops. He refuses to let that one pea go. He bends down and tries to pick it up, but his hands are full, so in his clumsy attempt, he spills 20 more peas.
It's getting worse.
Now it's frustrated. He sets down his handfuls to frantically try to scoop up the 20, but he knocks them over and spills them all into the weeds. He completely loses his temper, flies into a blind rage, violently scatters the remaining peas in all directions, and runs away screaming, having lost absolutely everything.
Kissinger was the monkey. He dropped one pea, the leak of the Pentagon Papers. In his desperate, volcanic, paranoid attempt to pick up that one key, he created the plumbers, spilled all the peas, authorized burglaries, and brought down an entire presidency.
If he had just taken a breath, ignored the Pentagon Papers, or treated them with aristocratic indifference, saying, yes, it's a tragic look at the failures of the previous administrations, let's learn from it and move on, the scandal would have eventually blown over in the chaotic 1970s news cycle.
Instead, his aggressive remedy was infinitely more destructive than the original disease.
It is the ultimate manifestation of a paranoia for security that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of destruction. And this ties directly into another vital psychological phenomenon we must dissect, the underdog effect.
Ah, yes.
When you are giant, when you hold the power, and you overreact to a tiny, relatively powerless enemy, you don't just look foolish. You actively manufacture deep structural sympathy for your opponent.
Why is that? Why do human beings instinctively root for the underdog, even if the underdog is technically in the wrong?
It's rooted in our evolutionary sociology and our innate sense of fairness. When we observe a massive power asymmetry, a giant crushing a gnat, our empathy naturally flows to the vulnerable party, because we project our own vulnerabilities onto them.
We inherently distrust unbridled, disproportionate power.
When a superpower uses a sledgehammer to kill a fly, we stop seeing the fly as a nuisance and start seeing it as a victim of tyranny.
We see this constantly in history. Look at John F. Kennedy's obsession with the Fidel Castro in the early 1960s.
The Bay of Pigs.
The U.S. government backed the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, attempting to overthrow Castro. You have a global nuclear superpower orchestrating an invasion of a tiny Caribbean island. The invasion was a botched, humiliating failure.
But the secondary effect was worse.
It completely validated Castro's paranoid rhetoric. It proved the imperialists were out to get him, and it elevated Castro from a localized dictator into a romanticized international hero of anti-imperialist resistance. It solidified his grip on power for decades.
We see the exact same pattern in antiquity. In 415 BC, the massive, wealthy, culturally dominant empire of Athens decided to launch a massive armada to conquer the relatively tiny, insignificant island of Syracuse in Sicily.
A giant attacking a gnat out of sheer arrogance.
But by entangling themselves in a long, drawn-out, grueling siege, Athens allowed Syracuse to test its mettle. Syracuse grew in stature, gained confidence, and attracted allies who hated Athenian overreach. The tiny island eventually decimated the Athenian fleet, triggering the decline of the Athenian Empire and making Syracuse famous for centuries.
But my absolute favorite example of the underdog effect, because it's just so incredibly human and petty, involves Franklin D. Roosevelt and his dog, Fala.
Oh, this is a brilliant piece of political theater.
It is the perfect encapsulation of how attacking downward completely and spectacularly backfires.
During FDR's unprecedented third and fourth terms, his political critics, mostly the conservative opposition, were constantly aggressively complaining about the massive amounts of taxpayer money being spent on government programs and the war effort.
But their attacks were bouncing off. They couldn't get any real traction with the public because the average American saw the president as a man who had guided them through the Great Depression and was now steering them through a world war.
The critics were desperate. They needed a visceral, easily understandable symbol of FDR's supposed wastefulness, arrogance, and detachment from the common man.
So, in their infinite wisdom, what do they target? They don't target a specific policy. They target the president's little black Scottish terrier, Fala.
A rumor starts circulating, and the opposition eagerly fans the flames in the press that FDR had accidentally left Sala behind on the Aleutian Islands during a trick and had ordered a U.S. Navy destroyer at the cost of millions of taxpayer dollars to turn around and retrieve the dog.
They thought they had found the perfect enraging angle. The president is wasting warships on a terrier while your sons are dying on the front lines.
But they fundamentally, fatally misunderstood the mechanics of human empathy. How dare you attack a defenseless little dog? It was a colossal miscalculation of tone.
FDR's response was a masterclass in political jiu-jitsu. During a major speech to the Teamsters Union in 1944, he addressed the rumor directly. But he didn't get angry. He didn't defensively show naval logs proving it was a lie. He leaned entirely into the absurdity of the attack.
He gives this incredible, deadpan delivery.
He says, essentially, you can criticize me, my wife, my family, but you cannot criticize my little dog, Fala. Fala's Scottish soul was furious when he heard these falsehoods. He has not been the same dog since.
The audience of tough Union truck drivers absolutely erupts in laughter and applause.
By targeting a tiny, innocent animal, his critics made themselves look unimaginably petty, cruel, and devoid of serious ideas.
And it made FDR look incredibly warm, humorous, and deeply sympathetic. He positioned himself as the genial defender of the innocent against these shrill, bitter politicians. It proves definitively that crushing, or even attempting to crush, a tiny irritant almost always creates a tidal wave of sympathy for the weaker side.
Just like the American public eventually sympathized with the outnumbered Pancho Villa. When you attack down the hierarchy of power, you invariably lift your target up.
Okay, so we've mapped out the pitfalls. Avoiding these massive historic blunders, like invading Mexico over a border raid or bugging the Watergate Hotel over a leaked report, is conceptually simple, even if it's hard in practice.
But how do we actually execute this? How do we practice this kind of tactical, calculated disdain in our everyday modern lives? How do we wield this psychological tool without just coming off as completely oblivious, sociopathic, or obnoxiously arrogant?
It requires immense nuance and emotional regulation. We can break down the practical application into three very specific, highly effective tactics. Let's walk through them. Tactic one is what we can call the weaponized sour grapes approach.
We discussed the fable earlier, but let's look at how it functions in real-world social dynamics.
We have the story of the brilliant French writer George Sand in 1861.
George Sand was a towering intellect, a powerhouse of 19th century literature. She wrote under a male pseudonym, but lived very openly and unconventionally as a woman. Her devoted supporters strongly believed she deserved the highest literary honor in the nation. They nominated her to be the very first female member of the Académie Française.
This was this incredibly prestigious, exclusive, intensely traditional institution of French intellectuals. It was the ultimate gatekeeper of cultural validation.
But Sand was exceptionally perceptive regarding power structures. She quickly surveyed the landscape and realized that the conservative, highly patriarchal, male-dominated academy was never going to actually admit a woman, no matter how staggering her literary genius was.
They were going to drag out the process, debate her morality, and ultimately reject her.
Now, her instinct, and the instinct of almost anyone in that position, would be to fight. She had the platform to write blistering, eloquent essays about the inherent injustice of the institution. She could have loudly complained about the blatant sexism, which would have been entirely 100% morally justified.
But she understood the mechanics of power. She realized that by complaining about the rejection, she would inadvertently signal that their rejection actually wounded her. She would be implicitly validating their authority to judge her worth.
So instead of whining beneath the trellis, she went on the offensive with preemptive disdain. Before they could formally reject her, she publicly and loudly claimed that she actually had absolutely zero interest in belonging to their little club anyway.
She mocked the entire institution, branding the revered academy as nothing more than a gathering of worn-out, overrated, out-of-touch windbags.
Why on earth would a vibrant genius like me want to sit in a dusty room with a bunch of irrelevant old men? I love it. It is so utterly disarming.
It was the perfect surgical strike. It entirely robbed the academy of the profound satisfaction of rejecting her. They wanted to feel the power of closing the door in her face, but she told them their house was crumbling and walked away.
She didn't allow them to remain the gatekeepers of her validation. She rhetorically burned down the gate.
As we discussed with the fox, crying sour grapes is often misconstrued as the coping mechanism of the weak. But in this specific context, it was the highly calibrated tactic of the powerful. She flipped the script so effortlessly that they suddenly looked like the irrelevant, stuffy ones, while she maintained her aura of independent brilliance.
That is brilliant. Okay, tactic two is significantly trickier. It requires a lot of nerve. It's about treating your own mistakes lightly, specifically when you're dealing with a master or a superior.
We have a fascinating story from 17th century Japan about Emperor Gosain, who was a deeply devoted disciple of the intricate tea ceremony, and his high-ranking courtier, a man named Dainagon.
The aesthetics and physical objects of the tea ceremony were treated with profound, almost religious reverence. The emperor owned this priceless, incredibly famous, historic, antique Ido tea
It
bowl.
was a masterpiece of pottery. All the courtiers envied it. It was heavily guarded and rarely even left the table.
But one afternoon, the emperor is in exceptionally good spirits. Dainagon, seeking to flatter the emperor's taste, asks if he can carefully carry the bowl over to the edge of the veranda to properly examine its glaze in the natural sunlight.
The emperor, feeling magnanimous, consents.
You can feel the tension building. You can see the disaster coming from a mile away in slow motion.
Dainagon carefully carries this irreplaceable treasure to the wooden railing. He holds it up to the light, and his fingers slip.
Oh no.
The bowl tumbles from his hands. It plummets onto a jagged, decorative rock in the meticulously raked garden below and shatters into dozens of tiny, unfixable fragments. An absolute masterpiece, centuries of history destroyed in a fraction of a second.
The emperor is, predictably and understandably, furious. The blood rushes to his face. The entire court freezes in absolute terror.
But Dainagon doesn't do what everyone expects. He doesn't throw himself face first onto the floor weeping. He doesn't beg for his life, offer to commit seppuku, or launch into endless, groveling, hyperventilating apologies.
Instead, he maintains his composure.
With a deep, respectful bow, he looks at the shattered pieces and says something absolutely wild. He says calmly, "It was indeed most clumsy of me to let it drop, but really, there's not much harm done. This Idu tea bowl is a very old one anyhow. It's not a thing of any public use, so I think it rather fortunate that it has broken thus."
Okay, hold on. I have to insert myself here and throw a flag on the play. Let's translate this to the modern world. If I borrow my boss's brand new top-of-the-line laptop to look at a spreadsheet, and I drop it down a flight of concrete stairs, and I look at my boss and say, hey, it was an old model anyway, it didn't really contribute to global GDP, so it's rather fortunate it broke, I'm getting fired before the laptop even hits the bottom step. Security is escorting me out of the building. How does this strategy possibly practically work without getting you destroyed?
It is a vital pushback. And the situational nuance here is the difference between survival and ruin. The strategic architecture explicitly warns that if you use this tactic among your equals or with a standard middle management boss, it will catastrophically backfire. You will seem callous, unaccountable, or genuinely sociopathic.
But Dainagon's maneuver works precisely and uniquely because of the context.
He's dealing with an emperor, a master who has built his entire public identity around his profound nobility, his Zen Buddhist detachment from worldly suffering, and his elevated spiritual status.
It's a Chinese finger trap for the ego. He is trapping the emperor in his own self-image.
Exactly. By treating his own catastrophic mistake with a touch of light philosophical disdain, by quietly signaling that the object, no matter how beautiful, was ultimately merely a brittle piece of baked clay with no true spiritual or public utility, Dainagon forces the emperor into a corner of aristocratic indifference.
If the emperor loses his temper, starts screaming, and orders Dainagon's execution over a broken piece of pottery, the emperor suddenly looks incredibly petty. He reveals that he is deeply, slavishly attached to material possessions. He looks emotionally fragile. He looks low.
He literally has to calm down and pretend he doesn't care, just to save face and preserve his brand.
Precisely. Dainagon completely bypasses the angry response. He saves the emperor the undignified energy of throwing a tantrum and simultaneously provides the emperor with a golden platform to publicly display how unbelievably magnanimous, enlightened, and unbothered he is.
The emperor is forced to laugh it off to prove his superiority. It is an incredibly high-wire, high-stakes psychological manipulation that relies entirely on reading your superior's ego.
That is just breathtakingly manipulative and brilliant. Okay, let's look at tactic 3, owning the flaw. What happens when you don't break a bowl, but you are caught red-handed in a massive lie or a deception?
We go to the vicious, gossip-fueled world of Renaissance Italy for this one, to a prominent writer named Pietro Aretino.
Aretino was a master of self-promotion. He had meticulously built his entire public persona, his brand in Venice, around boasting of his deep aristocratic lineage. He walked with the swagger of nobility, he talked like a duke, and he wrote with the authority of patrician blood.
He was accepted into the highest circles of society. But it was a complete fabricated fiction. He was actually the son of a deeply impoverished, lowly shoemaker from a provincial town.
Eventually, an enemy of his does the digging, uncovers the genealogical truth, and eagerly exposes him. Word spreads through the cafes and palazzos of Venice like wildfire. Everyone is aghast. The great, arrogant Aretino is a complete fraud.
Now, the human instinct here, the panic response, is to deny it, right? To stir the waters, to hire people to forge birth certificates proving your nobility, to angrily attack the person who exposed you and call them a liar.
But Aretino understands that if you make excuses or act defensive, you just draw more attention to the vulnerability. You invite further investigation. You act like a man who has been wounded.
So his response is an absolute masterclass in pivoting. He doesn't deny a single word of it. He steps out into the public square, metaphorically, and loudly announces, "Yes, it is entirely true. I am indeed the son of a lowly shoemaker."
But then, without missing a beat, he pivots the narrative completely. He claims that this lowly birth doesn't prove he's a fraud. It actually proves his absolute, undeniable, unmatched greatness.
How does he spin that?
He argues that while all the other dukes and nobles in Venice simply inherited their wealth, their titles, and their prestige by an accident of birth, having achieved nothing on their own, he rose from the absolute lowest, grimiest stratum of society to the very pinnacle of Venetian culture, purely on the horsepower of his own sheer genius, wit, and merit. He frames his deception not as a lie, but as a necessary stepping stone for a self-made titan.
He steals their ammunition, loads it into his own cannon, and fires it back at them.
Beautifully put, he trumpeted this new self-made genius narrative so loudly and with such overwhelming confidence that it entirely eclipsed the scandal. It became his new, even more impressive legend.
And from then on, he never mentioned the lie again. He completely owned the flaw, reframed it as his greatest strength, and entirely disarmed his enemies through his utter, chilling lack of shame. When you show absolutely no shame, your enemies have no leverage to shame you.
So we've covered an immense amount of psychological terrain. We've looked at the trap of engagement with Wilson, the mechanics of withholding attention with Chesterton, and these incredible historical tactics of disdain and indifference. It seems definitively clear that contempt is a dish best served cold, without any outward emotion, and that ignoring your enemies or lightly brushing past your own flaws is the ultimate expression of power.
But,
And there's always a but in the study of power, is there ever a scenario, a specific set of circumstances where ignoring a problem is the absolute catastrophic wrong move?
this brings us to the final, crucial segment of our analysis, the reversal, the festering wound.
The architects of this strategic philosophy are exceptionally careful to include this vital caveat. The overarching metaphor they use for this entire law of disdain is the tiny wound.
If you get a small, irritating paper cut or mosquito bite, if you constantly pick at it, you scratch the scab off, if you apply all sorts of harsh chemical ointments, you agitate the tissue, you make it worse, it gets inflamed.
You transform a tiny, insignificant cut into a highly visible, painful matter. If you just leave it alone, ignore it, and let your immune system do its job, time heals it seamlessly.
But what if it's not a paper cut? What if it's a brown recluse spider bite? What if it's a deep puncture wound that is actively infected?
Exactly. The reversal of the law warns that you must play the card of contempt with extreme clinical diagnostic care.
While the vast majority of small troubles, petty insults, and minor annoyances will naturally vanish into the ether if left entirely alone, some problems possess a different biology. Some will grow, mutate, and fester in the dark unless you attend to them. If you aggressively ignore a severe staph infection, you don't look powerful. You lose your arm.
The historical record gives us a terrifying example of getting this diagnosis fatally wrong. Let's look at the great established princes of Renaissance Italy.
They made a collective, fatal miscalculation. Early in his career, Caesar Borgia was just a young, relatively inexperienced general in the papal army of his father, Pope Alexander VI. The wealthy, entrenched princes of the Italian city-states, men who had held power for generations, looked at this young upstart and thought, he's just the Pope's illegitimate son. He's a temporary nuisance, a flash in the pan. We will ignore him. We will freeze him out of our diplomatic circles and show him utter disdain.
But Caesar Borgia, as history vividly remembers, was not a mosquito. He was a tiger cub.
Yes, and while the established princes were busy haughtily ignoring him, the cub quietly grew into a massive, lethal lion. Borgia wasn't seeking their validation. He was using their blind spot. While they looked the other way, he was secretly building formidable military alliances, acquiring massive wealth through ruthless campaigns, and sharpening his tactical acumen.
And by the time the princes finally realized the scale of the threat and paid attention to him, it was far, far too late. He was systematically gobbling up chunks of the Romagna, dismantling their territories.
And worse, their earlier arrogant contempt had not humbled him in the slightest. It had merely made him deeply personally vengeful. He kept a very precise ledger of exactly who had snubbed him when he was weak.
So there's a massive existential danger in misdiagnosing the nature of the threat. If you arrogantly treat a growing tiger cub like a buzzing mosquito, you are eventually going to get eaten.
Which leaves us with the ultimate synthesized strategic formula. The mastery of this law does not lie in ignoring everything. It lies in developing the acute perception, the situational awareness, to accurately distinguish between a mildly irritating nuisance that will naturally fade away if starved of oxygen, and a potentially disastrous rival that is quietly building critical mass in the shadows.
And if you identify the latter, if you realize you are dealing with a Borgia and not a Pancho Villa, how do you handle it without falling into Woodrow Wilson's trap of overreacting?
The formula is an exercise in dual realities. Show contempt publicly, but monitor the problem intensely and privately. You must project the outward image of the unbothered, detached sovereign. You give the threat no public validation, no press conferences, no oxygen. You do not let them know they have successfully commanded your attention.
But behind closed doors, you never, ever completely take your eye off them. You gather intelligence, you map their networks, you track their movements. As long as the threat possesses a spark of vital life, you watch it. You do not let it become a cancerous, metastatic cell growing in the dark.
Public disdain, private vigilance. You present a wall of ice while quietly sharpening your sword in the basement. It is a brilliant, layered, deeply pragmatic approach to navigating a highly combative world.
It truly is. It prevents you from squandering your finite emotional and temporal energy on endless, petty, exhausting battles while keeping you fundamentally safe from the genuine structural threats that require calculated, quiet, lethal action.
We have mapped out an immense amount of psychological and historical territory today. If we are to synthesize everything we've decoded from this concept, your attention is your most precious finite resource. It is the currency of your life.
When you freely give it away to an internet troll, to an irritating colleague looking for a reaction, or to a minor, irreversible setback, you are literally paying them with pieces of your own power. Withholding that attention, mastering the brutal art of strategic disdain, is the ultimate, unassailable expression of control.
You determine the geography of your own battleground. You dictate what possesses mass and existence in your reality by consciously choosing what you illuminate with your focus and what you cast into the void by turning your back.
I want to leave you with a final thought, a lingering diagnostic question to apply as you navigate the rest of your day. Think about your own life right now. Look at your social media feeds. Look at the relentless, hyperventilating 24-hour news cycle. Look at the petty, recurring, exhausting dramas in your office or within your social circles.
It's everywhere.
What if the things we are most desperately obsessed with right now, the things that make our blood boil, that keep us up at night, that make our thumbs type furiously in the comment sections, what if they are just modern-day Pancho Villas? What if they are algorithmic and social traps, deliberately designed to drain your energy, your time, and your emotional reserves while giving you absolutely nothing of value in return?
It's a sobering thought.
Think about that mosquito whining in the dark room. You don't have to turn on the blinding light. You don't have to smash the lamp. What incredible untapped power, what profound, unshakable peace might you unlock tomorrow if you simply looked away? Thanks for joining the deep dive today. We'll catch you on the next one.
Take care.